for us to go. I am ready for us to go. Today's session, we'll be talking to the famous Ed Cyprian. I didn't know how famous he was until I made the post today. Then I realized, oh, wow, he's very famous. So we will be kicking off the conversation in a bit. If you haven't been here before, PBI is, oh, there we go, here he is. Okay, if you haven't been here before, PBI is the People Building Institute. Our aim at PBI is to begin to change the future of Africa by changing the mindset of Africans, African business people especially. We want to push local content by developing the mind. And that is why we're called the People Building Institute. However, we're not just interested in developing the minds towards in terms of or sociology. We're interested in pushing that so that we can start producing and manufacturing in Africa and put us on par with the rest of the world. And so if you are excited to be here today, I'm sure some of you came because you know Ed. I'm grateful that you're here. You're all welcome. All our PBI team that is here, you're welcome. I am grateful to have you here. And Ed, if I could see you, I could just see your face, to say hi, I'd be grateful. Hello.
Hi, can you see me? I think my camera should be on.
Yes, we can see you. Okay, Kofi, could you spotlight his video so that we could stay on him? Hello, Eddie. Before you joined, before you joined again, I was giving the update to our viewers today on what PBI is about, and then also what we'll be talking about today. So I just finished talking what PBI is about and what we'll be talking about today. For those who are PBI people and don't know you, unfortunately don't know you, I would want to do a quick introductory conversation so that they can get to know your background and where you will be drawing from in having this conversation on operations. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So to kick off, first, what is the substance that you, if you had to describe Ed to somebody, what would you say his substance is?
Interesting. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer that question correctly because I think I'm constantly seeking to find that out for myself. But today, I think my substance is really in terms of trying to leave an impact. And the way I'm looking to do that is by maximizing my time and more or less trying to figure out ways to provide efficient workflows in anything I touch. I don't know if that kind of answers the question you're looking for, but it's something that is continuously evolving for me. So I'm still figuring out myself.
That is a very good answer. I've heard a couple of people that have been able to answer the question that way. So in terms of the thing that gets you excited, if you have to say, I'm talking about business, right? I'm talking about just, yeah. Okay, we get it. Okay, what would you say gets you excited now in the business world?
Money leaving people's pockets into my pocket. I'm just playing. Honestly, what gets me excited is the ability to create. Like I said, I'm driven by finding better ways to do things. And right now I'm driven by better ways to do things here on the African continent, but also as an extension of African businesses to the rest of the world. How can we do things better? Not necessarily compete, but how can we do things better? If we do things better than whoever our competitors are, that's great. At this point in time, it's all about getting where we are right now to a better level. And then when I say we, I mean businesses in the African continent, how we do things and how we achieve our objectives and goals.
That fits right into our conversation today. So people, you understand why he's the one we're talking to today about operations, because he is interested in how we do things and how to do them better so we can compete on, I believe, the global scale. Let me start from the top, punching high. What is the problem with operations in Africa in general?
There's several different problems with operations in general. I guess every sector, every market will kind of have what stands out for them. But I guess let's try to start off and trying to trying to define what operations really does for a business at the end of the day, right?
That'd be great.
So
Yeah.
the whole objective of operation is really to kind of like you put in raw materials, you put in income or cash flow, and you're supposed to be able to generate something for your customers. You have an outcome of it. And the operations is the process how you get from what you're putting in all the way to the customer satisfaction. And so it's everything in between that involves efficiencies of it, quality of it, and deliverables in general. So when you say what's wrong with operations, the question that should sit at the back of your head to kind of like answer that question is, what do we feel about the services and the products that we are delivering from our businesses, at least in the context and the perspective I'm thinking about in Africa? How do we feel about those products and businesses, those products and the services that we're delivering from them? And that would kind of start to answer the question about what's wrong with operations in Africa. So in essence, I mean, there's a lot of people have complaints when you go over to an African restaurant. I'm not picking on African restaurants. It's just something that is a common thread, at least around the circles that I've kind of like roamed in. Food is delayed, right? So sometimes food is delayed and everyone has that, oh, it's normal, we kind of get used to it. But that's a problem of operations in essence as well, right? If we pick another item, like for instance, you go somewhere and your favorite food is on the menu, but it's never available. That's another problem of operations as well in my head. And not picking on that market, but in general, but just looking everywhere, customer service is a problem more or less of how we deal with operations, right? Down to data and how we understand our customers and provide for them the best quality products. We don't really have any good standardizations and specifications that we follow across every industry. There's some outliers in general, but those are some of the problems in regards to operations. We also don't necessarily have access. There's a lot of tools that are created in the Western world that are used to enable work and deliverables to achieve the outcomes that we are desiring from a business. Half the time, those tools are designed and geared towards the Western world. And as a result, we don't have access to leverage some of those tools to better our operations and provide the efficiencies that we're more or less looking at. So those are some of the problems. We don't have custom tools built towards the solutions that cater to our market, for instance. There's several different problems. There's several different ways we can kind of take it. And then we also kind of have more or less a human capital problem where our economies are not necessarily stable. So the best and the brightest of minds are typically looking for an escape outside of the country. So they're trying to migrate to different countries. So that depletes the continent of some of the greatest resources, which is the human capital, outside of the resource of the raw material as well. So once we don't have the best people working within our organizations, essentially we are impacting operations to some extent as well. So there's a variety of ways we can look at what's wrong in terms of operations in Africa, but those are some of the things that kind of stand out for me. I don't think I can hear you any longer, or is it on my end?
Yes, I was muted. Thank you. So quick from what you said, the key thing that stood out for me was that you said the output shows what's wrong with operations, right? So whatever you're putting out shows what's wrong with operations. And then you've mentioned that poor standards, and then tools that are not customized for the solutions that we need in Africa, and human resource capital is also some of the things that are
correct.
Going from what you said about the fact that that question is broad, can we start from in terms of inputs into operations? when you look at the way some of the operations that you've looked at across the country or the continent, the ones that are working well, what are the good things they're doing in terms of the inputs they have put into their operation systems for them to stand out to you that they are working well?
So again, across different industries, those inputs will change, but the common thread across all of them is software and technology. That's one common thread. If it's even software or technology in a lower scale in terms of something enabling a farm, like simple RFID tags, to something as complex as drones kind of helping figure out problem areas in a large acreage of lands, or up the chain to something like an Excel system to a more improved CRM system. The several different aspects to that, but the broader tone of where we can improve significantly is technology and software. And then an underlying tone of improvement or an underlying tone of problem area would be infrastructure. There isn't a good infrastructure in general in Africa that is geared towards like road network, logistics, or we can have all the best solutions towards software-enabled economy, but if we don't have the right telecom infrastructure, it really serves us no good, right? So the infrastructure as well, it seems to be lacking. And then beyond that, there isn't a lot of capital moving around in Africa as much as we presume relative to the size of the continent and its people. As a result, but that's slowly changing now. But as a result of there being a lot more capital injection and a lot more research on the continent, we will start to see a lot. Well, we will then be able to see a lot of these areas where we can improve upon things. But these are some of the problems that, as it stands today, that I can outline across the different industries. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of inputs,
I'm not sure if I answered that question correctly. I think I forgot the question halfway.
No, you did. You did. So the question was, in terms of the businesses that you see that were operating properly, what are some of the inputs that they have put in that were efficient?
Gotcha. So it's the reverse of what I answered. So,
yeah, so you mentioned software and technology, you answered the infrastructure, that's access to communication, roads, and then you've also mentioned capital. So for businesses that have the right softwares in place, whether it's a simple software like Excel or a complex CRM, and then businesses that have access to communication, proper communications to reach the markets, the roads, to bring in goods, and then also bring out products, and then have the capital to be able to finance all of these things. They are the ones that you realize that their operations are working well. Okay. So now that you talked about the input, we would move on to the process, right? Because once you put the inputs in there, you have to process it. So again, for businesses that you have seen, that you have experienced, that you have worked with, that are doing well in Africa, again, the outliers that we're talking about, what are some of the things that stood out to you in their processes that made them do well?
So this will be a hard one for me. I'm not sure if I fully understand any business that I admire from the outside looking in, what their process internally is like. But this is a difficult one for me to answer. And the question is first identifying which businesses do we feel are doing well and managing their operations fairly well. Usually, and now we talk about African firms or yes, any business just operating. Okay. Because that, yeah. So,
but you don't have to name them. Just if you look through your experience with them.
So looking through them, some of the things that I think stand out is kind of the one of the major problems that I kind of pointed out earlier is the transfer of the human capital outside of the continent. If those resources have been able to tap into some of that human capital that still remains here, and those are some of the brightest and the brilliant ones, or they've been able to leverage some other human capital from outside the continent, that kind of helps them put structures in place and procedures and policies in place, and different standardizations and checks and balances that kind of helps catch problems at an early stage of the process, right? And I think that's probably it. So at the end of the day, the human capital is what really drives more of like an organization really being an outlier, because once you have the best minds in your firm, they will channel the processes that will help your organization function a little more efficiently. They will channel the resources like capital that is necessary, the very little that is available on the continent or beyond the continent. I've seen organizations successfully be able to retrieve large sums of capital, especially going on in the Nigerian market right now from the Western world. So there isn't too much of a barrier, right? There is a barrier overall, but there's people that are able to tap into some of that. And then just leveraging our education system as well. Typically, there's a case study where the students that are being produced out from some universities, and those students typically, when they go into the working force, tend to find to yield better performances, better results based on the nature in which they were taught or to think and to kind of like solution for problems. So those businesses that are leveraging a better outcome are literally leveraging the best and the brightest of individuals, and realizing that the human resource at the end of the day is the most valuable piece to kind of like bring everything together.
You heard it here, the human resource. Okay. Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you. Again, just to recap, just in case you just joined, I have asked him about the processes in some of the businesses that he's had the experience with that stood out for him in terms of good processes that stood out for him. He's mentioned that human capital is the number one. The human capital is the number one. He also mentioned during his presentation that structures, business structures, procedures and processes, and then standards for monitoring were also part of the things that those businesses did that made them stand out to him. Okay, so as usual, now that we've gone through input and process, we're going to go to the output. You already mentioned the output when you talked about the restaurants, but now I want to talk about the businesses that are doing well, in your experience, that are doing well. What are some of the things that stand out when you experience their output, whether it's a service or a product? What are some of the things that stand out to you when you experience their service?
Knowing who your customers are. And I think really at the end of the day, knowing who your customers are and kind of meeting their expectations and it's not only meeting their expectations, it's also knowing who your customers are and finding the right balance between what to push on for your customers versus just trying different experimentations altogether. So for instance, if your customers are in general the working class, and you know the means through which they consume their information, and then you're able to leverage that channel or that medium, then you see those businesses thriving a little better. So it's essentially, my argument is not every business necessarily needs to utilize, for instance, the social media marketing in the same way where they're trying to sell. Sometimes it might be a social impact, depending on the nature in which they do business and who their customer is and where they're present. But businesses that provide an outcome have a good relationship with their customers, where they understand what the customer needs, and they're fine-tuning towards that need over time. And they're targeting the right customers as it goes along. The other aspect of what makes for a good outcome is also in the lines of what I already spoke about internally. If your process was well defined and your standardization is well defined, it kind of really reflects in the products you put out there. The quality is seen in it. I mean, there are different jokes across different industries, and I'm not going to go into the jokes, but really, you can clearly tell someone's professionalism by the time it takes them the effort they took into getting you the work you needed, and how they presented that as well. So I think that speaks through the entire operations and process flow again that we were talking about. So really the outcome is really still defined by what you put in, and how you manage that middle layer.
Thank you very much. Knowing so you said something about knowing the customers and then using that knowledge of the customers to add on maybe new products or new services to them. Could you expand on that a little bit?
So, so I have, I'll try to give an example. For instance, I have one entity that has, and all my entities typically like to collect data on their customers in various ways. And we do a lot of anonymous reviews to kind of like understand what the customer feels, right? So there is an entity where they have good feedback overall on customer satisfaction, but they have relatively not poor feedback, but not as good feedback on the layer of delivery, right? But we don't control the delivery, but we still have feedback that our product in the process of delivery is not necessarily a good experience. So at least we have that context. And as we figure out the best way to move around that context, it changes the outcome in terms of the satisfaction of a customer towards our product. As much as we're not in the delivery business, it kind of impacts our product and how our customer feels about that whole experience, right? So the operations of trying to figure out what we do there and what we change and how we mitigate that, or how we transfer risk, etc. Once we're able to fine tune that, it kind of is a win towards operations as well.
Data.
Yeah. So yeah.
Data. The last conversation we had with the expert conversation, we spoke to a customer experience manager and consultant who mentioned something as simple as knowing that a customer closes at 5 p.m. can help you to suggest a later delivery time to the customer instead of inconveniencing them trying to get them the delivery early. And something as simple as that could win a customer. How simple? I want to say how can a business simplify their data collection in such a way? No, that's not the question. What is the most simplified version of data collection you have seen for a business, a small startup? What is the simplest, or what would you advise would be the simplest data collection that they need to pick up?
I guess a rating data collection would kind of be the simplest. If you can quickly get on a scale of 1 to 5 how you feel about our services, it gives you an average idea of where people stand with what you're delivering to them. Even if you cannot get anything, you can start playing with that service or product and try to figure out if that rating is changing. If at the bare minimum you can't get anything, is how do you feel about my product? And even if they're not going to give you any extra comments, that's at least good enough to let you know if there's a general problem. And you can start kind of like digging on what can I switch for this customer to see what it is. So that's kind of like an added value. Like this example you cited with knowing that the customer even closes at 5 kind of helps with that. We experienced that with one of my entities as well, where we realized that when someone places an order, there is no expectation of when the product is expected to arrive, right? Regardless of where they're located. So once the product is not arriving in maybe 30 minutes or 40 minutes or 60 minutes, whatever time that they thought was reasonable for the product to arrive in, it is late. And so then how do we control that? In that scenario, what we decided to do is, instead of just ordering, you go ahead and place the time slot in which you want the food, in this case, to come to you, right? And in that sense, once you say 2 o'clock, you have set the expectation that it gets to you at 2. And we are just meeting the expectation. It's still the same trickery where it takes maybe an hour, but you're setting the expectation now. So you're not, if it comes beyond 2, then yeah, that's different. But it's kind of like understanding where the frustrations of the customer is and trying to find a way to kind of change how the customer interacts with that frustration. For instance, as well, when our products are going out, we alert the customer by sending them a text and SMS notification that the product is out for delivery. So there's that expectation, okay, this is on time. I don't need to call and check where is my product. And it's very simple, little things like that. But when there's no communication, especially when dealing with a customer in terms of the customer satisfaction experience, that leads to the customer drawing their own conclusions. And that's where the problem is. You kind of have to set the expectation early on with the customer. In our case, we set the expectation by allowing the customer to select the time for delivery. And then we just have to meet the expectation. So obviously we've built in systems in place to make sure that whatever time is selected, we are able to meet that. But yeah.
So again, great answer, especially when you mentioned you setting an expectation is important, because it is critical. If there's no expectation, I can rate you on whatever I want to rate you on. And so that is really critical for us here in the output. I'm going to go back to input, because you mentioned something earlier in our conversation about supply chain when we spoke earlier. I know that you're in real estate also. And I have heard that it's one of the most complicated supply chains because of the different elements involved in building one house. In terms of that, what are some of the bottlenecks that you have in laying out a proper supply chain for real estate?
So the biggest bottleneck in real estate in I wouldn't say Africa. Let me narrow it down to the regions in which we work in. So let's say the biggest bottleneck in terms of the supply chain in Ghana for real estate will be capital injection. So typically contracts are signed and contracts have an expectation of deliverable by a certain time period, with an expectation of a certain net amount of cash to mobilize at different points of time. That is never usually the case. So that's one of the biggest challenges with real estate. And as a result of that, that makes it more difficult to track the progress as expected, for one. The second complexity with real estate in general, not necessarily geared towards the market in Ghana, is the change requests, the different changes that come along as you're building. So your expectation of what you had started with changes often, and that's kind of like a part of the job. But when we're talking about managing supply, that's something that kind of impacts that a lot. So if you're building a fairly large structure and you had to kind of like pre-order a bunch of like iron rods, for instance, and you had certain specifications and those change, there's a loss there, there's a cost there. I mean, there's different things along those elements that you need to think about as well. And also, again, more closer to our locale and how things are done locally, there isn't a reliability of suppliers. And that causes an issue with an expectation of maybe you're getting something done today and it maybe takes a whole week, just because the suppliers or subcontractors are not necessarily always reliable. So I mean, and I don't think you're looking for the solutions. I guess you're just asking for some of the problems, right? So those are some of the things I can think of off the back of like some of the issues in terms of managing supply chain within Africa, for instance, or in Ghana specifically, if I'll narrow it down a little more.
Okay. So whilst you were talking, I was making sort of a map of the conversation we've had so far, and going from the terms of outputs, one of the key things that you mentioned is that you set expectations. And when you gave the example of your business, is that you allow the customer to select the time, and then now you work backwards to put your process in such a way that you're able to meet that request.
I want to, there's a caveat to that.
Sure.
We let the customer select the time, but it's under the notion. For instance, if what time is it now? It's 7:30.
Yeah.
If you came into the platform right now to order something, the earliest time you can select would be, say, quote unquote, 8:30. We're not
Mhm.
allowing you to select 8 o'clock because we cannot deliver anything in 30 minutes. So there's a
Yeah.
caveat to that. We allow you to select time, but we've kind of already baked in when we can do work by, so that it's kind of like blends and blurs the line of we delivered on time versus,
Mhm.
you know.
Okay. So you allow the customer, so you set the expectation in the way that you can deliver.
Yes, but we allow the
Okay.
customer to feel like they're the ones setting the expectation.
That's in the expectation. And then your processes now have to match up to meeting that expectation that you've allowed them to select.
Correct.
And then now your input have to be able to support the processes that you've put in place to be able to meet that output.
Correct.
And then with the inputs, you've mentioned that the problems usually, you use the real estate example, but with the inputs, you've mentioned that the problems are usually the capital and the suppliers.
In that specific market.
In that specific market. So, and for instance, since we're using a food business as our case study throughout this process,
Okay.
Which is the donut business. In the donut business, for instance, the input in terms of being able to deliver a finished donut to somebody in 45 or an hour when they order it, what would you say would be the problems that you would anticipate? Looking at our environment in Ghana here, what would you say would be the problem to anticipate from input to process to output?
So some of the problems would be consistency.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a culture in Ghana, and maybe not for the broader Africa, but maybe at least for the broader West Africa. We do have a culture where, in general, we don't follow recipes. We're very used to kind of like winging things based on how we feel and tasting it as it goes along and trying to make it work like that. So as a result, I don't think too many people know how to cater for large mass orders where you need to have calculated recipes and things done properly. So this is just a general statement. Obviously, people that go into that have a little better understanding, but you still find that there's a little bit of inconsistency in terms of the end results, and that's by virtue of not having a well-documented recipe that can be repeated over and over again. Also, part of that problem potentially could be, and I'm not an expert here. I'm just kind of helping along this scenario, right? So a part of that problem would also be the raw materials as well. It's probably not also consistently reproducible in terms of food. It's not like we have a lot of homegrown stuff, and if you're buying stuff from the market, you're not going to necessarily get the same consistency over and over again in terms of weight, quantity. So that also kind of impacts what goes down your both rule-making process. There's also the idea of a lot of things are also imported into the country. So there's probably also the factor of cost fluctuations into the ingredients, and that kind of provides a big bother, a big headache in terms of a business that is leveraging cash flow to continuously stay alive because they need to turn around and buy more ingredients and generate a little more revenue. And the middle processes as well, we do have systems like FDA that help facilitate good standards, but I don't believe they're strongly, I think they could probably be a little stronger in their enforcement. But I presume as it stands right now, those also probably provide a little bit of operational issues where, and that's not really on the institution's fault, but because there's also that internally, if you don't have the right managers or supervisors, you tend to see different processes being skipped just because maybe people are lazy or they forget, or there's not any it comes back to recipe, I guess, in that scenario. There's not any well-documented process and recipe to kind of like support that as well. And also not being able to gauge your your traffic properly on any given day, you don't have enough data to understand what your traffic looks like. As a result, you only produce a limited amount of items, and then causing a delay in terms of like the orders that come in at a later part of your day, for instance. Not prepping enough or pre-prepping enough in advance, where you can kind of like account or solution for some of these things on the fly. Not anticipating enough is more or less the better word. So sometimes you can anticipate, hey, and all this comes back to data. If you're typically used to seeing 50 orders by 12 o'clock and all of a sudden you have 100 orders by 12 o'clock, you shouldn't wait till 5 o'clock before you start realizing, okay, we have a problem on our hand. You start kind of like mitigating that issue fairly early on. And if we had better representation of that data, because obviously if you're making the Beauforts, all you know, or the donuts, all you know is it's going out, but you don't really have an idea of how that's impacting your average daily sales, and if that's something you need to take a closer look at. But we're talking specifically about donuts, so let's keep it at donuts. Yeah.
Well, after all that I've heard, if I don't start a donut business tomorrow, change my name. Okay. But you have been extremely helpful in our quest to hack the donut business market. You've mentioned, as a recap, input for the donut. No, let me start from the output. So the output would be a consistent product. That would be the solution. But today we're talking about problems. So the problem with the donut business model in terms of operations would be that there would be inconsistent end products. And then we jump to the input, where you mentioned that there might be no recipe. And because there is no recipe, then the raw materials, you don't have like a standard of raw materials. You don't even know how many raw materials you need. So you might not have proper cash to be able to support producing the same donut all the time. And then also you don't have data to forecast the demand that you're going to have for each given day, looking at what your orders have been like. Then in terms of the processes, again, you mentioned that because there was no recipe, there was no standard measurements, which would result in the inconsistent output, that there would most likely be no production process, again, which would result in the inconsistent output. And then as you were speaking, you also talked about the distribution of the donuts, again, when you linked it to the data. But then I just added on in there that there might be a problem with packaging, because if the packaging is inconsistent, then you would also have a problem with the end product. So, because we have our donut operations plan, let's just go. Let's just go. Start running. Let's just go start running. Thank you so much, Ed. So far over the past 40 minutes, we've gone into what operations management is actually, what are some of the outputs, and then you've mentioned the highlight is that the output shows what your operations looks like. Poor standards and uniformity. We've talked about the inputs in business, where you mentioned infrastructure capital and then software and technology. You also mentioned the processes, and you mentioned and emphasized on good human capital. This is something that I want to go into now. What is wrong with the human capital currently available for African businesses, especially startups or SMEs, that is making them fall off as quickly as they start?
When you say making them fall off as quickly as they start, can you elaborate on that?
Okay, so you know the world statistics of 70% of businesses fail in the first year, 90% fail in the next 5 years. Similar situation is happening in Africa, especially in Ghana. From the little poll I think we run in the beginning, a lot of businesses admitted to having stopped and then started again, or they stopped and they've not started again because one worker did something. So I just wanted to know.
I wouldn't particularly blame that on the human capital or the human resource.
Okay.
I would likely blame a lot of business failure anywhere in the world to improper planning, not enough or accurate research, and just shit out of luck with the market as well. I think that's more so than if you plan and research a business model enough, you should be able to have well-documented processes and identify clearly the resources you want to hire and the expectations from them, the requirements you need, and then have the right people on board, and then have the right price point to then leverage a product that would return capital in a set amount of time that you've identified, such that you would not be able to run out of business, and it's repeatable over and over again. Most businesses in Africa, at least from my understanding, don't make it past a lot of their generational wealth or third generational family management control. And I think it's really down to the planning and the documentation and processes that are fine-tuned and put out that anyone can run that well-oiled machine, more so than the human resources. Because if the car is not gonna drive, I don't care if you put the best driver in the car, it's still not gonna drive.
Good point. If the car's not going to drive, even if you put the best driver in the car, it still won't drive. Quote Ed Cyprian. So thank you for that. I'm still going to go back to the human resource thing. Okay, so as a business owner.
There's nothing wrong with us as Africans, so I don't know why you keep going back.
I'm going to go back to that because you did mention good human capital. And sometimes it can be a mismatch between the business and the person. Right?
Yes, but who's that on?
That's on the business owner, and the business owners are the ones we're talking. So that's why I want to really go back there for them to understand what's possible and what's not good. When it comes back to good human capital, what would you say is the best way for an entrepreneur, a business owner, a business manager to select? What should they be looking out for when they are setting out their human capital strategy?
I don't think I have the right answer for this question. In my experience, there is no one size fit all.
Okay.
The way I go about it is I look for, in general, a certain core underlying someone that is willing to learn and capable of learning at some expedited rate. And then someone that is willing to challenge the way they've been taught to think about work, where they can challenge the status quo, and not necessarily just wait for the tasks to just be poured down and for them to just check off those lists. I'm looking for someone that looks at some of those elements. I've seen businesses that also are well established, and it also depends on where you are as a business. When if you're starting off as a startup, the kind of human capital you need is people that are pretty much generalists, right? That can touch anything and everything at any given time and kind of like work a little more than 8 hours a day and put in their all and help achieve the dream beyond the first couple of years, right? And slowly you move to people that are specialized, that have really gone to school and studied the specific space and can help you kind of like streamline and provide efficiencies in their sectors in the business down the line. But, and I skip a little steps in between that, but my point is when you start looking for people that are really specialized, then you're really looking for people that can speak to what they know and can really implement the changes that you're expecting right off the bat without you having to kind of like handhold them. The willingness to learn new things is not as critical always in those roles. It's just more important that they understand what to do with the information they have in those roles. I guess it really depends from my perspective of where the business is at and what they're dealing with. But for the most part, I favor someone's willingness to learn and someone's quickness to learn. And then most importantly, their ability, because in Africa, or I hate saying Africa because I haven't this, I haven't traveled enough to Africa to kind of like generalize a statement for us. But in Ghana, we are not trained to think too much outside of the box. We're trained to kind of like follow the status quo. And so as a result, it's very difficult for some people to kind of like come out of that. And I'm still trying to figure out the ways to kind of like leverage and trim those people out of that. Because once I do, I have access to a larger talent pool. But initially, without having that on my side, I'm looking for people that immediately show signs that they can think outside of the box.
And you said you were not in a position to answer the question. You have completely annihilated the question. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Things to pick up on the human resource that he mentioned was the fact that when you're a startup, you need more of a generalist, somebody that can touch everything. And then as you grow, you need to move into the specialist in your area. But with a specialist, what you need to give them is that they need to understand what the business needs their unique skills for. Apart from that, when you're looking to hire, when Ed is looking to hire, he considers or prioritizes somebody who's willing to learn, quick to learn, willing to think, and then willing to challenge what has been given to them. Thank you. That is a very good answer, sir. Thank you very much. So it's now 7:47. We have gone through the three stages, well, the three general stages of business process management, which is the inputs, the output, the process, and then the input. And then we reach back to go to supply chain for the input, and then we reached forward to go to customer satisfaction for the output. And in terms of processes, we did mention about the procedures and policies and the standards. Ed also mentioned about government agencies. He mentioned the FDA. So that is one of the things that can affect your processes, which is the standards that the country that you operate in or the legislation requires. So Ed, thank you so much. We have a question. And I'm going to read that from Richmond Doku. He says, should we venture into a business where there seems to be less or no data about demand, supply, transport, traffic, etc., especially as seen in Ghana?
Can you say that last part again? Should we venture into a business where there's less data about what?
Demand, supply, transport, traffic, especially as seen in Ghana.
So the misconception is that data has to always be available to you. The truth, what really in essence data is, doesn't mean it's some magical piece of information that is put out there for you. Where there is no data, you do the research and provide the data, more or less.
Richmond, you have your answer. Very short, very simple. Where there's no data, find it. It's available. Okay, if you have any more questions, please drop them in the box and he will do justice to that question. In the meantime, Richmond is laughing. Yes, I think he's got his answer now. In the meantime, I did have some questions from Instagram. Somebody wanted to know about you and your experience in business. I said I'd leave that to you.
That's the question in general, me and my experience in business?
Yes, that was a question. What is his experience?
I'm not even sure how to answer this question. What's my experience in business? Failures, success, all in between. I've experienced it all. I don't know. I've touched different markets. I'm someone that has a heart in a lot of different things. So my training and my background is in software development. But I have touched software development, obviously construction, then healthcare, food and beverage. There's a variety of things. Right now, I'm also curious a lot about supply chain. So I'm just generally looking at those markets in general. But really, at least where we stand right now, what we're trying to achieve, it would enable us to touch different businesses within the continent of Africa, because our goal is really at the end of the day to kind of like drive back a lot of revenue into the continent and retain the human resource and the human capital within the continent. So as a result of which, we would leverage anything that would kind of allow that, at the same time yielding the results that we expect. So that keeps a high standard for what it means to be an African produced product.
Now you have me intrigued. What it means to be an African produced product. Can you expand on that?
We can probably expand on it in a different conversation, but essentially changing the narrative of what it means to be an African produced product or service. And part of that narrative, especially for like at least BendOps, which is one of the subsidiaries, the narrative for that is, I think we started off where we talked about there's a lot of software that is produced in the Western world that is geared towards their needs and their customizations. So it doesn't really solve for all of the problems we have on our continent, for instance. For instance, how if we wanted to use a payroll system or we wanted to use an accounting software or anything, it probably is accounting for everything in dollars, right? Here's the case where we deal with things like cities or Naira, and we deal with mobile money and different things. So there's not really access, or it doesn't allow for, some of those softwares may not allow for some of those things. However, the African continent is the most diverse continent of them all. And if you adopt a philosophy where you're building something for the African market first, you're likely building something for the whole world, because we see a bit of everything on our continent. And so we changing the way the mentality around African products is building and delivering products for the African continent first actually serves the world in the long run, because we're so diverse, and solutioning for things in our continent would by default solution for everyone in the world.
You've left me with a lot of sound bites today, you know.
Really?
Like the first one is definitely going to be the output shows what's wrong with your operations. I think I'm going to use that in almost everything I talk about nowadays. Your output shows what's wrong with your operations.
You're not licensed to use it, though.
I will coach you. It'll be a coach. That's everything, you know.
I think I prefer royalties than the quote. So keep the quote. Send me a check.
Oh my goodness. But then the second one is that the African market is so diverse that producing a product for the African market is like producing a product for the world. This really is a great note for me to end on. But as usual, I always want more. Is there another question in the chat box? Okay, no. To Mary. Hi, Mary. Okay, so businesswoman in logistics. Okay, so Ed, as we are rounding up, we have 6 minutes more. This 1 hour went by really quick, didn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I didn't realize it was been an hour. Yeah.
1 hour went by really quick. So as we're rounding up, what would you say are your final, not your final statements, but your summary of this conversation on what's wrong with operation, specifically in Ghana, West Africa?
There's not enough focus on process and documentation. Documentation of procedures, SOPs, and everything. There's not enough focus on those things. And then the ultimate problem is actually, if we have the process down, then we know the right way. If everything is documented, we have the right steps to follow to hire the right human resources. We have the right steps in place to target our market or reach out to our market. So I think that's the fundamental thing. If we can get that a little better, a little right, we have access to better cash injection, because everything is well outlined and people can clearly see where their money is going. So it's more easy for them to invest into the organization. So fundamentally, if we get our process well documented and well defined, I think it really changes the narrative heavily.
Thank you. Thank you for that. The process is defined, it changes the narrative. I would have said goodbye to you, but somebody snuck in a question on my WhatsApp just as you were talking. They said, well, this is a consultant also, so I understand where the question is coming from. They said in Africa, everything is artisanal. When will we move to mass production? What do you think can be done about that?
That's a really good question. I think that's a question more so for governments than businessmen or people trying to set up operations. It's very hard to produce for the mass market because every country does things a little differently. And there's a lot of barriers in terms of like the way business is done in Africa involves a lot of who you know and who you can pay off, honestly. As a result of that, even the bigger giants that have conglomerates still struggle a little bit to kind of like provide a one-stop solution for the entire market. I'll give, for example, mobile money. We leverage mobile money across different countries, but it's not one mass product. We can't easily send from a Ghanaian mobile money network to a East African mobile money network. It's not a mass market. They have to tailor custom solutions for each market. So the governments really control that. The more they can be aligned, the easier it makes it to kind of like produce a one-stop solution across the continent.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure they heard that. Again, it's been amazing. The recap, I have 4 pages of notes from this conversation.
Send it to me.
Okay,
I need the notes as well.
I'll send it, no problem. Thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate the conversation, and I look forward to the solutions conversation next week because I know that's the strong point and that's the focus of your business. So next week we'll have the conversation on the solutions to all these problems that we have listed here. If you're a business owner, you're a business manager, and you're listening to us, or you're an entrepreneur starting out and you're listening to us, make sure you join us next week because going through the problems with inputs, the problems with processes, and the problems with outputs, finding solutions for that would be vital for your business and your management of the business that you're managing going forward. So this is PBI. We're very, very interested in growing the African continent by changing the mindset of the people. And we will keep doing that by having these conversations and making them available to you. If we can spark the mind of one person, that is enough for us to start making a change in Africa. So thank you for joining me. I've been Elena. I've been talking to Ed Cyprian of so many businesses. I can't mention all of them. So I'll just leave it as Ed Cyprian. Thank you for the time, Ed. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, guys, have a great evening. Goodbye.